All right, let's talk about landscapes. You can think of landscapes exactly the same way as you think of portraits. The rules do not change. Let's take a look at this piece by Sean Galloway again. And I'd like to direct your attention to one more thing we haven't discussed yet, and that is how this piece only uses two values, average light and average shadow. There are no halftones, there are no highlights. It's just two values spread over a series of different local values. Landscapes can be achieved in the exact same way. Consider this great piece by Eyvind Earle. This piece is made of nothing but average light and average shadow. No halftones, no highlights, no dark accents, no reflected light. It's simply two values applied to each different surface. And of course, his shapes are beautiful, with a nice range of big to medium to small. Here's a painting by Paul Lessane that kind of follows in the same tradition. A few more shapes in this painting, but value-wise, look at each shape and notice it's simply average light, average shadow. There are a few different edges in this piece. If you notice the background mountain, there are a few soft edges back there where the snow is. But in general, the edges are all firm to hard, and with just a very clear average light and average shadow defining each element. Landscapes can be this simple. Dialing up the complexity just a little bit, let's take a look at this piece from Tangled. It also has very clear shapes of light and shadow. If you look at the cliff, for example, the fence line is very clear between light and shadow, right? But within the shadow, we have good use of reflected light. These shapes here, you'll notice, are just a step lighter than the average shadow beside them. And that helps the cliff to have different kind of faces like we'd expect to see in real life. Looking at the shaft of the castle here, I actually see four values. I see average light, then I see halftone, which is responsible for merging it into shadow. I see average shadow, and then on the very left side, that shadow lightens just a bit as it gets some reflected light from the cliffs. Let's take a look at these three tree shapes here. They are just dark local value shapes in shadow. And notice how, because they're in shadow, they have a reflected light, in this case motivated by light coming down from the sky, just lightening the shadows just a little bit to give those form. And by the way, I do realize that I'm showing you these pictures in color, but I'm doing so to encourage you to train yourself to just see the values. Here's our favorite piece from Paul Felix again. Take a look at the simple, beautiful shapes of average light, and of course by comparison, the beautiful shapes of average shadow next to them. On the main hut here, take a look at the shape of halftone that brings the average light into shadow. As you can predict, it's just a slight darkening of the average light value. On that same hut, take a look at the shadow underneath the hay roof. Notice how it's not just one value the whole way across. There's a reflected light, getting bounced light, likely coming from the ground. It lightens the shadow, but does not make the shadow compete with the actual values in the light. In this entire painting, it's very clear which family the values belong to, light or shadow. Let's test our theories out with a quick study. I'm going to approach this like I did the first Sargent portrait study where I traced the shapes, except here I'm not really tracing the shapes, I'm laying them in by hand. I'm starting with kind of local value, whether, are things light or dark, like the roof of the huts are fairly light, the stonework is fairly light, the grass is fairly dark, the sky is this medium gray, and the hill behind it is somewhere in the middle as well. Of course, now these forms are split then from there into average light, average shadow, and some of them even have halftones, and some of them even have reflected light. That's another point. Not every object needs the same treatment. With some objects, you might have just average light, average shadow. Then with some objects, you might need a halftone. Some objects, you might need a halftone and a reflected light, or just a reflected light. You change it per object. So I've got my local values laid in. And now I'm going to break them down further and start adding, in this case, the average shadow for the huts. Now, I'm kind of estimating the value just based on sight. Okay, I'm looking at the reference, and it's quite dark in the shadow, so I'm putting that value in. The shadow of the rooftop, notice, is a lighter shadow because it's a different 5-value consideration because it's a different local value. So the rooftops both get that value. Now the huts are immediately starting to look good. They're looking like they have form, and I've just got two values there. Okay, the grass is all in shadow, which means it's got quite a dark value. It's very close to the shadow of the huts. Going back into the mountains in the background, just doing a quick selection, and I'll use that as a guide to paint. This would be average light of the hut, and then I'll invert that and just start going into the shadow. Now that value is not quite dark enough, and I realized that later on, darkening up a little bit here. Still not as dark as it is in the Paul Felix painting. And you'll notice in this area, I've actually got it wrong. The shadow of the huts is actually lighter than the shadow of the background hills. So I have to kind of alter my values a little bit to leave room to go darker for the background hills. I hadn't gauged that properly in my first pass, and that's okay. I can just fix it. Same thing here, darker with the shadow value of the hills. Just getting all of my local values with their appropriate 5 value considerations. The sky needs to go a bit darker, so I do that. This is what painting is like for me. I'm always considering, should this go a little lighter, a little darker, based on its local value. Of course, the clouds are the lightest areas of local value, and the darker everything is around them, the lighter they will look. So that's another consideration. You can key values off of each other. And just laying in just some patchwork of dirt that shows through. And of course, it gets its own local value. So its shadows are a little lighter than the rest of the hill, and its lights are also a little lighter than the rest of the hill. The clouds, being white, their shadows are much lighter. See that? It's its own local value, so it has its own average shadow value. We're nearly done. We have to do halftones still. There's the halftone that bridges the kind of mason work of the hut from average light into shadow. Of course, I'm altering my edges as well to become a little softer. The windows are just dark accents. I just painted those windows. And here, just a bit of reflected light to show the windowsill. Okay, these are all, everything adheres to the 5 value rule. Here's some halftones in the straw roof just to get it more subtly to merge into shadow. And then just, playing with my shape here. And just like I did with the portraits, this is no different. It just happens to not be a portrait. It's a landscape, but it's all shapes, guys. Shapes are shapes. It doesn't matter what you're applying them to. Just making this area just slightly darker through the use of an airbrush. And then the last thing, also just adjusting their edges, as the mountain fades into the sky. Some slight soft edges back there. We're going to talk about atmosphere, I believe, next week. This is not quite the time for it. Oh, and here's that reflected light passage just underneath the roof of the hut, which gets it slightly lighter, but again, it still remains in shadow. Oh, and here's a bit of ambient occlusion here. I just figured less light would be able to hit that, and you can see it in the Paul Felix painting too. There's just a slight darkening within the shadow. This is kind of a big cheat, just using an airbrush to kind of vignette the corners, and we're done.